Hello everybody, and welcome to my little video lecture on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. There it is. Um, a couple little disclaimers at the beginning of this video. I'm going to give these same disclaimers before every video because since this class is set up in such a way that you can read these novels in whatever order you want, I'm going to have to give these disclaimers in case this is the first time you watch this video. Disclaimer number one, I'm going to try to keep this video under 30 minutes. I know that sitting here watching me talk to you about this book might get a little bit boring, so I'm going to try to keep it as short as possible. There's a timestamp at the bottom that'll tell you how long I really went. If you don't have enough time to watch this video in its entirety, then please, stop it now and go ahead and come back whenever you have the time that's required to watch it all the way through. Another hint that I can give you for watching this video so that you don't have to sit here and keep watching me flap my gums is that you might want to open up the PowerPoint presentation that goes with this video that is included in the same folder where you found this video link at. So I'll pause for a minute if you want to open that, and then you can kind of block me out and have the PowerPoint presentation on the screen and follow along with what I'm saying in the PowerPoints. And I think the PowerPoint in conjunction with this video will help you understand what I'm trying to tell you better. So I'll pause for just a second here. All right, let's get on with it. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Pride and Prejudice. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Jane Austen's biography. There are a couple of things that I think are very fascinating about it. One is that even though all of her books, this one plus all the other books that have been published, the main topic is marriage and the importance of a woman of getting married, Jane Austen herself never did marry. She had a couple of opportunities, but she wanted to marry for love rather than marry for convenience, which is exactly what Elizabeth Bennet does in this book. She wants to marry for love, and she wants to be swept off her feet. That is not the reason that most women got married back in those years. Most women back in those years got married as a matter of convenience because of the fact that it was necessary a lot of times for a woman to marry in order to be taken care of after her father passed away. So, also, I think it's interesting, not important, but interesting, that this was actually written as pulp fiction. It was supposed to be, just a popular book that people would buy, and she would make some money off of it. That's why she would write it. Little did Jane Austen know at the time that she was writing a classic that still resonates to this day in the 21st century. So that's pretty cool. All right, so Pride and Prejudice is a comedy of manners. What we mean by a comedy of manners is it's poking fun at society in some way. And everybody thought that that was pretty important because of the rules of society and how everybody has to follow them, so on and so forth. And Jane Austen here is just poking fun at them. And she starts with the very opening sentence of this book, one of the most famous opening lines in all of English history, or English literary history, I should say. And it is this. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So, here's what Jane Austen's narrator, because remember, you don't want to confuse the narrator with the actual author, is saying in this book, and that is, well, if a man's got a fortune, and he's young, and he's handsome, and he's not married, then the only thing he's missing in his life to make his life complete is a wife. Let's go on to the next part. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, the truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. In other words, I am a man with a daughter that's of marriageable age. Back then, this would have been as young as like 16. So I've got a 16-year-old daughter, a 20-year-old daughter, a 25-year-old daughter who's never been married, and there is a young, handsome, rich man in the neighborhood. Well, by golly, it's his obligation to marry my daughter, and therefore he must do so. And of course, you can imagine that every father and every mother in the neighborhood would be trying to compete for this one man with all the daughters in the neighborhood. So, whether that guy wants it or not, he needs a wife, and therefore the surrounding family is going to make darn sure he gets one. All right. Looking at the main characters a little bit, Elizabeth Bennet is the Elizabeth Bennet is the main character of the novel. She is the main protagonist. Most of the story is told from her point of view. She is the second of 5 daughters to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Bennet is not poor by any stretch of the imagination, but he's certainly not extremely wealthy either. He's probably what we would call upper middle class. She is a very intelligent lady. She's very spirited, very opinionated. She doesn't mind arguing with people who have a little bit of a higher social status than she does. And she wants to marry for love. She doesn't want to marry out of convenience. And you'll see as we go through this that she does have a chance to marry for convenience and rejects that chance completely out of hand. So she's looking for love. And Fitzwilliam Darcy is one of the richest men in all of England. He would be, in today's American terms, he would be one of the 1%ers. He is extremely wealthy. He's also extremely prideful or vain or arrogant, if you will. And that kind of puts people off to him, especially Mrs. Bennet, who is Elizabeth's mom. So this is the man who also is looking for the right woman. Because believe me, if you're one of the 1%ers and you're single, women will throw themselves at you. And so Darcy has a little self-defense mechanism here, which is to repulse all women by being such a jerk. And it works on everybody, including Elizabeth. So these are the two main characters that have to fall in love and get married by the end of the book. The rest of these characters we'll talk about as we go through. Jane, I think, is important because she is Elizabeth's oldest sister. She's in love with Bingley, and Bingley's in love with her. And there are some problems that come up with that because of Darcy's pride. And I also want to mention Lydia Bennet here. Lydia is the youngest child. Although she's the youngest child, she's going to end up being the first to marry. But it's almost a scandalous affair. She nearly ruins the Bennet family to the point where Darcy would have not been allowed to propose to Elizabeth. And we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. And George Wickham, if you're looking at the slideshow that I am, George Wickham at the bottom is the man who she has this little dalliance with. I can't stress the importance enough of how Lydia's indiscretion ends up being the main crisis of the book later on. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Collins, Lady de Burgh, we can go through all this in a little bit. So let's talk about the themes. Well, let's take a look at the chapter. We've got pride and we've got prejudice. Pride is, if you look in chapter 5, and I'll go ahead and turn to that little passage. There's a little passage in there about the difference between pride and vanity. And it goes a little something like this. This is almost at the end of chapter 5, about 1, 2, 3, about 4 paragraphs up, and then about the middle of that paragraph. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. So really, when people are guilty of pride in this book, or pride as a sin, according to Austen's narrator here, what they're really upset about is the vanity, not the pride itself. Because if you have a little self-confidence and pride in yourself, that can be a good thing. But the problem is that that's not always the case when people have pride. Sometimes they think that others should think highly of them. And this is represented most through the character of Fitzwilliam Darcy. He's extremely wealthy and from an aristocratic family, so he's been brought up to believe by his upbringing that he is better than many other people. And he believes it wholeheartedly. It makes him very unpopular everywhere he goes. People say, what a vain man, what a prideful man. We cannot like this person. And he is not very well liked, especially in the Bennet's neighborhood. His pride, though, gets in the way of his finding true love because he thinks that Elizabeth, and after he gets to know Elizabeth a little bit, he thinks that the Bennet family is beneath him. And that because they don't have as much money as he has and as much of an income as he has, and because, once Mr. Bennet dies, the daughters aren't going to get the property anyway because it's entailed, he doesn't think that he should marry into the Bennet family, and he's going to convince Bingley later on in the novel that he should not marry Jane for that very same reason. And this is what causes problems. It is not until Darcy overcomes that pride that he ends up winning not only the undying love of Elizabeth, but also Elizabeth's mom because she wants her daughter to marry a rich man. So it's amazing how quickly, once Elizabeth becomes engaged, that Mrs. Bennet goes from despising Darcy to, oh, I love him, he's the best son a woman could ever have. Well, yeah, with that bank account, I guess he is. All right, but there's pride throughout the novel. There's Collins, there's Lady de Bourgh, who is a very, very proud and very distasteful woman. Mrs. Bennet exhibits pride, especially as she keeps marrying daughters off. So pride is shown not only through Darcy, but through all the characters. And then we got prejudice. Elizabeth is the one that's guilty of this. Just like Darcy has to overcome his pride in order to marry Elizabeth, Elizabeth must overcome her prejudices in order to be worthy of marrying Darcy. And what we mean by prejudice here is she prejudges people based on very little information. She's going to really judge Darcy harshly, and she's going to judge Wickham much more nicely than he deserves. And eventually the truth about Wickham will come out not only to her, but through the rest of the neighborhood. And then all of a sudden, everybody that loved Wickham suddenly doesn't like him so much. So these prejudgments and this judging people without having enough information about them is the fatal flaw of Elizabeth that she must overcome in order to win Darcy over. There are other characters, though, throughout the novel. Mrs. Bennet is very prejudicial, especially on Darcy, because Darcy had the nerve not to want to dance with Elizabeth the first time they met. Well, he's a jerk. He didn't want to dance with my daughter. Well, yeah. Of course, Darcy himself is prejudiced against the Bennet family, and a lot of it has to do with the party at Netherfield, which we're going to discuss here in a few minutes. And really, if you were in Darcy's position at that party at Netherfield, you might think the Bennets were an undesirable family as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he does prejudge them based on that one night at the party. And then, of course, Collins. The people, they judge Darcy harshly as well. All right. Marriage, major theme of all of Jane Austen's literature. Marriage is extremely important. We've already looked at the opening sentence, but the whole goal here is to get the Bennet daughters married off because the property at Longbourn is entailed. So Mrs. Bennet makes it her mission to marry these daughters off. And we see when Mrs. Lucas marries Charlotte off to Collins, this upsets Mrs. Bennet to no end. How could Charlotte Lucas end up getting married before any one of my 5 beautiful daughters did? Pride, right? And prejudice against Miss Lucas, although we will learn that Charlotte does marry out of convenience and not out of love. But that happens a lot in this novel, and that happened a lot back in these days. A lot of women were kind of forced into marriages they didn't want, not because they were in love with the guy, but because the guy had enough money to take care of them. So, Mrs. Bennet's mission is to marry them all off before Mr. Bennet's death so that they won't be turned out into the streets by Collins once he inherits the property. Marriage can keep property within a family. Today we think of marrying cousins and we, kind of want to throw up, right? We don't necessarily think that marrying cousins is a good idea. But it was a lot more common than you would think, especially in the middle and upper classes, all the way up until about the early 20th century, to be honest with you, because of the fact that property had to stay in a family. So that's why when Collins visits Longbourn Estate, which is the Bennet's estate, he is looking to marry one of those 5 cousins of his. That way, the property will stay in the family. And Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet, until he gets to know Collins a little bit, both like this idea a lot, because then that means all the daughters will be taken care of because the man of the house is married to one of them. So keeping property in the family is one of the reasons why cousins married quite a lot. And now that's no longer important. So now, of course, we think marrying a cousin, right? But not so much back then. And then marriage can unite 2 families together. A lot of times, and this is still even true today in the 21st century, I think, when somebody marries a person, they don't just marry that person, they marry into that person's family. So this is kind of, you're not just, so Darcy realizes that he's not just marrying Elizabeth, he's marrying into a family that has Mrs. Bennet and has Lydia, which is why he saves Lydia's reputation, and has Mr. Bennet in it, and all of the cousins, like Collins, who his own aunt has taken a liking to. So the uniting of families advantageously. Royal weddings in the past had been done to unite two warring countries together. The prince of one warring country marries a princess of another warring country. Now they can be at peace with each other. So marrying advantageously into a family is important now, but it was even more important back then. All right, family reputation. One family would only approve of the child of the family marrying into a family if that family had a good reputation. This, ladies and gentlemen, is why when Lydia runs off with Wickham, it is such a huge crisis. It is why everybody's in an uproar. It is why everybody says we must find Lydia, we must save Lydia. We must save Lydia because by saving Lydia, we can save all the Bennet girls. This is why Darcy spends so much money to pay off Collins's debts and to enlist him in the regular army instead of the militia, and to make sure that he and Lydia are taken care of, because if Wickham and Lydia don't marry, then Lydia has besmirched all the Bennets, and then Darcy would never be allowed to marry Elizabeth. So Darcy hates Wickham. Let's make no mistake about that. He has a disdain for Wickham that's unbelievable. He can't stand the man. But he's going to save Wickham because it's the only way he can keep Elizabeth's reputation good enough to actually be allowed to marry her. And even when he does, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is his aunt, still doesn't like it. But, she can just, whatever. Okay. So I think we've said enough about that family reputation. That Lydia thing really plays it out more than anything else. But even Lady de Bourgh, when she visits Netherfield, everybody's like, oh, the great Lady Catherine de Bourgh has visited us. Why? And then we find out it's because she's going to tell Elizabeth, hey, I want him to marry my daughter, which basically means cousins marrying, of course. I want him to marry my daughter. He can't marry you. Your dad doesn't have enough money. All right. Self-knowledge. One of the absolute most important themes in this entire book. This is a very famous passage in chapter 36. This is right after Elizabeth has rejected Darcy's proposal, and done so because she has heard things about Darcy that are very undesirable, particularly about Darcy's handling of Jane's relationship with Bingley, which, of course, Elizabeth loves her oldest sister, and her oldest sister's heartbroken now, so she's upset at Darcy for the role he played in that. And especially, she doesn't have all the information she needs about Darcy's relationship with Wickham. So because Wickham is handsome, and because she had actually been in love with Wickham at one point, she actually despises Darcy because the only side of the story she's gotten about what happened in that relationship is Wickham's side. So, after she does that, Darcy writes her a very long letter about explaining why he broke off friendship with Wickham, and explaining why he felt like Jane wasn't good enough for his friend. And when you read his explanations of both of these in that letter, and it's a pretty long letter, you finally see Darcy's side. And you get to understand Darcy a lot better, and Elizabeth gets to understand Darcy a lot better. And the more she thinks about it, and the more she processes this in her mind, the more she realizes, I've been wrong all this time. Everything Darcy says in this letter makes sense. Everything Darcy says in this letter can be verified. Why didn't I see this before? It's because I was blinded by my prejudices against this man. And so she's upset now. So this is, what is this? This is it's right after the letter that Darcy has written. Actually, no, the letter, I guess, is chapter 35. So in my book, in this edition here, it's about 4 pages in, almost at the end of the chapter. All right, so I'm going to read this passage because this plays into the self-knowledge theme and the importance of knowing oneself. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. How despicably I have acted, she cried. I, who have prided myself on my discernment. By the way, discernment means the ability to judge others. So she has prided herself on the ability to judge others. So I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery? So here she's now learned all this information about Darcy and how despicable Wickham is. How humiliating this discovery is to her. Yet how just a humiliation. In other words, she's saying, when she says how just a humiliation, I deserved this. I deserve to be humiliated right now. This is my own fault. Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. So again, she's accusing herself of pride, right? Pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. So she's saying here, based upon first meetings, I have judged these two men, and I was wrong on both counts. I did not use my reason until I read this letter. Till this moment, I never knew myself. That is a turning point in this entire novel. This is the moment where Elizabeth Bennet grows up. This is the moment where Elizabeth Bennet changes from a silly little girl into a wise, intelligent woman who sees her own faults and now knows that she must address them. If we don't have this moment in the novel, Elizabeth never falls in love with Darcy, and we'd never have a happy ending. But because she came to this realization after reading Darcy's heartfelt letter, she immediately matures. Every good novel should have that moment of maturation where the actual character comes to a realization that is necessary. All right. So that's enough about the self-knowledge. And then I have a couple of slides here of other important points. Longbourn is an entailed estate, so I need to explain what that means. That means no woman, not Mrs. Bennet nor any of the daughters, will be allowed to actually inherit Longbourn estate after Mr. Bennet's death. It must go to the nearest living male relative. Now, this is kind of strange because Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter will inherit Rosings Park. So there's some ambiguity there. But the fact is, that is why Mrs. Bennet must marry. Collins is going to get this estate whether he wants it or not because he is the closest male relative to Mr. Bennet. And so if Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet would have had a son, we don't have Pride and Prejudice. This story doesn't exist because the son would inherit and take care of the sisters and the mom. But because it's a distant cousin and one that's already married outside the family and one that has already been rejected by Elizabeth when he proposed to her, that causes a crisis. All right, common careers for second sons and beyond. Usually only the eldest son would inherit property. Second sons had to be taken care of in other ways. And usually it was done in one of two ways. Either the father would purchase officer's title in the military. See, back then, an officer didn't become an officer by going to West Point or by working his way up through the ranks. An officer became an officer because his dad had enough money to buy him a colonel rank or buy him a lieutenant rank or buy him a captain's rank. So that's usually what happened to younger sons. Or they could go into the clergy. Now remember, Wickham was supposed to go into the clergy and then decided he didn't want any part of that. And that's part of why he and Darcy have their little rivalry. So those were really the only options for second-born, third-born, fourth-born sons unless the oldest son died and then the next one in line would inherit. So that's why Colonel Fitzwilliam, even though he comes from an extremely wealthy family, is a colonel, and why Wickham can only get like a lieutenant or something because that's all Darcy will pay for. All right. Accomplishments. Very important. If we were doing this in a full semester, I would have you read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Accomplishments were simply skills that a young girl could develop that would make her attractive to men. So she would learn how to sing a little. She might learn how to play a couple of songs on the piano. She might learn how to write a little poetry and then read it out loud. Now, she wasn't allowed to be a Shakespeare in her writing. She wasn't allowed to be a Mozart or a Beethoven in her piano playing. She wasn't allowed to sing like, I don't know who the best singers were back then, but, not like a Pavarotti or something, or actually, bad example, but, she wasn't allowed to do all these things well enough that she was one of the best in the world, but she had to do it well enough that she would attract the attentions of a man. Women back in these years were taught how to attract husbands. They weren't really taught how to keep them after they got married. That's what Mary Wollstonecraft talks about in Vindication. But they had to just establish these accomplishments to establish themselves as marriageable girls. A girl's education, if she was upper middle class or if she was upper class, was designed to teach her how to attract a man. And by having these skills or abilities, then that is called accomplishments. They talk a little bit about how Darcy's sister at 16, Georgiana, is extremely accomplished. Well, she should have been. She was from an extremely wealthy family and had the luxury of having a lot of free time to learn how to do things. Miss de Bourgh, even though, Lady de Bourgh, even though she is extremely wealthy, her daughter Anne was too sick to learn a lot of accomplishments. This is another one of the reasons why Catherine de Bourgh wants her nephew to marry her daughter, is because she doesn't have enough accomplishments really to attract other men. Forget about the fact that she's rich enough and she's going to inherit one of the richest estates in England. But still, aside from that, she doesn't have these accomplishments. And then, of course, when Mary sings at the Netherfield Ball and embarrasses the Bennet family, is because she's not accomplished enough. She doesn't know how to sing well enough. She knows how to, sound like a cat being run through a lawnmower, but she doesn't know how to sing well. And that's why after 2 songs, Elizabeth's like, Dad, get her to stop. So that's the accomplishments part. In chapter 29, when Lady de Bourgh is amazed that the Bennets have 5 daughters who are out, what that means is 5 daughters that have been declared on the market, if you will, for marriage. And the way that a daughter came out was usually about the age of 15, possibly 16, but around 15 or 16, basically once she, has had her first menstrual period. She gets presented to the king or the queen of England. Back in 1813, it would have been a king. She goes to court, and it takes months to prepare for this. It takes months to prepare for what is essentially 30 seconds of the girl's life, where she would walk into the courtroom, or to the room where the king is sitting on his throne, and usually the queen is on his arm, and there's all these officials around. And the lady would walk in, curtsy to the king. Her name would be announced. The king would acknowledge her. She'd walk out, and now she is out. She is able to attend balls. She's able to attend dances. She's allowed to date once she comes out. And she's marriageable. And a lot of these girls did get married at 15. Remember, Lydia is 16 when she married Wickham. So, and it was not that uncommon. Because a man wanted to marry his daughter off as quickly as possible for a couple of reasons. One is to make sure she's taken care of for life. And a lot of fathers would approve marriages of their 16-year-old daughters to 30-something-year-old men, because of the fact that the men had the money to take care of the daughter, and so that the daughter would not ruin the family like Lydia nearly did by having an affair and getting pregnant outside of wedlock. Because once she does that, she's no longer marriageable. She is actually damaged goods. And about the only profession open to her then is prostitution. So when Lady de Bourgh is like, how can the Bennets have 5? And of course, Lady de Bourgh actually bashes the Bennets for the way that they've raised their daughters. She's actually very, very mean about it. And Elizabeth finally has had enough, and she defends her parents. And Lady de Bourgh and Collins are both taken aback. How dare a woman of lower social status argue with the great Lady Catherine de Bourgh? But, Elizabeth does that. And Collins is mortified because, she is, Lady de Bourgh is Collins's benefactor in the parsonage. So, that's what's meant by coming out at that point. So all 5 of the Bennet girls have been presented to the king and been deemed eligible to marry. The reason that Bingley's ball at Netherfield is such a mortifying experience for Elizabeth is because her family acts so poorly. Her family embarrasses her. You probably have family members now in your life that have embarrassed you at some time. Think back to some time when some family member of yours got drunk and made a mess of things, and you're like sitting there going, "No, that's not really my cousin. Oh, no, that's not really my sister. That's walking around hitting on every man in the room. No, that's not her, even though it really is." Yeah, that's what Elizabeth's going through when her mom is making a spectacle of herself, bragging about how Jane is going to marry Bingley and isn't this great. when Mary sings 2 Psalms 40. And then when Collins breaks decorum by walking up to Darcy and introducing himself. Remember, Darcy's shocked. Who is this man who has the gall to walk up to me and introduce himself without, one of my friends saying it's okay? And of course, Collins thinks that because Lady de Bourgh is his benefactor, and Lady de Bourgh is also Darcy's aunt, that it's okay, but it really wasn't. So, of course, this is mortifying to Elizabeth. And then, of course, the Netherfield ball directly influences Darcy to persuade Bingley not to marry Jane, because he convinces Bingley, do you really want to marry into that family? I mean, I know Jane is beautiful, and I know that Jane is a sweethearted girl, but do you really want to marry and have that as your mother-in-law? Seriously? So the Netherfield ball is a very crucial turning point in the story. And finally, the last slide I've got on here is about how the marriage of daughters brings social status and esteem to the girls' mothers. That is why when Mrs. Bennet thinks that Jane's going to marry Bingley, she's a braggart about it. That is why she's mortified when Charlotte Lucas marries before any of her own daughters marry, especially the Collins, who is supposed to marry Elizabeth. That is why when Elizabeth rejects Collins, she gets all upset and says, you will change your mind, young lady. To which Elizabeth is like, no, I'm not. Yes, her reputation is based upon how quickly and how well her daughters marry. And notice the progression here. Lydia is the first to get married, but she gets married to a scoundrel in Wickham, a guy who can't pay his bills and a guy who relies upon Darcy to take care of him, and a guy who has to have his career purchased for him by Darcy. And Lydia, remember, just before the marriage, nearly scandalized the whole family, nearly ruined the family, but she was the first to marry. So now all of a sudden, Jane goes from being her favorite daughter to her second favorite daughter, and Lydia, who's the youngest, ends up moving up to the top of the hierarchy. Then as soon as Jane's engagement to Bingham is announced, Bingley is announced, then all of a sudden, Jane becomes the favorite because she's marrying wealthy. That girl Lydia, she's way up north and she's married to a scoundrel. Who cares about her? Now Jane is marrying well. So Jane is now the favorite. And remember, throughout this entire novel, Elizabeth may be Mr. Bennet's favorite daughter, and she is throughout because Mr. Bennet's, a smart guy. Not a very good dad in some respects, but a very smart guy. And a very witty guy at that. But Mrs. Bennet's least favorite daughter is Elizabeth because she thinks that Elizabeth is the least marriageable of the bunch. And she despises Darcy because she thinks Darcy's a proud man. However, as soon as it is announced that Elizabeth is engaged to the great Fitzwilliam Darcy, all of a sudden, Elizabeth is catapulted into the status of Mrs. Bennet's favorite daughter, and Mrs. Bennet, who could not stand Darcy and wished he would never come around again, suddenly loves the man. Why? He's got a lot of money, he's marrying her daughter, and raising Elizabeth's status, therefore it's raising Mrs. Bennet's status. So this explains the pride that Mrs. Bennet has towards her daughter's marriages. Alright, so that's about everything I have to say. If you have any more questions or comments about Pride and Prejudice, feel free to email me or feel free to call me or visit me in my office. I'll be glad to discuss this book with you. I'll be glad to discuss every book in this class with you. I really love these books that I've chosen. I think that you'll love them as well. But I think I've hit on all the highlights and all the important points. If you watched this before you read the book, I hope I didn't spoil anything for you. But it is a comedy of manners, so it is supposed to have a happy ending, and there is supposed to be a marriage at the end. If you read the book first, I hope that this video has clarified anything that confused you before. And if not, then we can talk about it some more. And I also hope that this video, in conjunction with a slideshow, will help you when you write your paper as well. So that's it. That's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I hope you're enjoying the book if you're still reading it, or have enjoyed it if you read it. And I hope that this video and the slideshow has helped make it more understandable and more enjoyable for you.